Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's Mindful Monday session. This month is a particularly special session because it actually marks the start of Children's Mental Health Week, which we know in all the recent times and the events that children and young people have been living through, it's a very important time to think about and reflect on how we can best support children with their mental health and their overall well-being. So I'm Dr. Sumner, Head of Positive Education, and we also have with us today Miss Stephanie Ward, our Positive Education Lead for Secondary. So let's get started and have a think about what it is that we're going to cover today and how we will go through our top tips. So the first thing we're going to talk about is 5 top tips for supporting children and young people's well-being. Then we're going to look at resources that we can use to support children and young people. And then we'll go to our question time, where we've taken and grouped your questions that you submitted when signing up to this webinar and answer those. And Miss Ward will be helping us from a particular secondary perspective on looking at some of the questions that you guys have asked. So let's think about tip number 1. So we often forget about this one, which is looking after yourself. So this comes up time and time again when we're thinking about supporting children and young people with their emotional well-being, with building their resilience. The first thing we need to do is look after ourselves. And what happens when we're really stressed is self-care is usually the first thing that goes out of the window. Interestingly enough, self-care is what helps us to feel less stressed. So if you have a look in the window, you can see that there's different types of self-care that can support us, physical, emotional, social, and spiritual. And it's safe to say everybody has felt the effects of the pandemic over the past few years in some way or another. And so looking after yourself is very important. It's almost like the analogy that we're very familiar with on the aeroplane. In the event of emergency, you always put your own oxygen mask on first. Why? Because unless we're feeling okay, it's hard for us to support other people, particularly children and young people. So when we're responding to children, if they're feeling particularly anxious or in a particularly stressful situation, we have to think about putting ourselves into a space where we also feel quite calm when responding to stressful situations. 80% of communication is non-verbal, so we often think that children and young people don't pick up on how we're feeling when we're very stressed, and we're trying not to show them, but in actual fact they do, because they sense this from the body language and the communication from their key adults around them. So very important, looking after yourself, tip number 1. So just have a think about and reflect upon the ways in which you can do that. Tip number 2, this in fact has come from our child wellbeing surveys that we do in school. So as you know, we run a positive education curriculum and ethos at Regent School. And as part of this, we're always gathering children's views to look at, how they're supported with their well-being in school, and also their overall holistic well-being in terms of how they can best engage with their learning. So one thing that has come up, I think, over the course of the pandemic, but also more recently, is some children are saying they don't feel as though they're getting enough sleep. And there may be many reasons for this, but if we take, for example, a look at the chart that we have in front of us, it tells you, sort of breaks down the different age ranges, how much sleep children and young people should be getting. We know that sleep is crucially important for learning. And if we're talking about building resilience and boosting positive emotions, then it's essential that children have had an adequate amount of sleep to be able to do that and ultimately engage in their learning. So if we take, primary school, 3 to 5 years and 6 to 12 years, we're looking at 10 to 13 hours sleep for 3 to 5 years and 9 to 12 hours sleep for 6 to 12-year-olds. Then as we're moving into the teenage years, we'll be looking for around 8 to 10 hours. So there are certain things that we can do to support children to get better sleep. And one of those is thinking about device usage before bed. So the recommendations are that children don't interact or engage with any devices around 1 to 2 hours before bedtime. And the reason for this is because most of the devices that we have in our houses, tablets, iPhones, different gadgets, some TVs, PlayStations, many devices, they have something which is called a blue light. And that blue light can interfere with a hormone called melatonin, which is released in the brain to support children to sleep. And when children are on the devices just before bedtime, it can absolutely interrupt their sleep because it prevents the brain producing the melatonin hormone. So it is really important that we think about how we can support children to come off the devices at least 1 to 2 hours before going to bed. And that way we know they're getting an adequate amount of time to wind down. Another top tip for sleep is having set bedtime routines. So going to bed roughly around the same time and getting up roughly about the same time each morning, and thinking about what children have to eat before they go to sleep so that it's not something that makes them feel too full, the meal's not too heavy, but just a light snack so they don't go to bed hungry. So those are some things to think about with sleep. If you have concerns over your children's sleep, please feel free to reach out for further support and advice. So let's go on to tip number 3 now, where this tip really is, again, in response to the feedback we've had from children, thinking about what's been most important for children and young people during the course of this pandemic, and also what's most important for them when we're thinking, how do we build their emotional resilience and their engagement with learning? And that's actually recognizing their emotions, listening to them, and having a space to talk about it. So you'll see on the screen there is the catchy phrase, which is name it to tame it. This is taken from an approach called emotion coaching, and it's very much based on the principle of when we see children expressing emotions, that we label what those emotions are, particularly for younger children, and they have to understand what it is they're feeling in order to start to control the way they're feeling and begin to self-regulate. So labeling emotions, particularly in younger children, is really important. So I can see that you're feeling sad, or I can see that you're feeling worried, because that's a process of validation. And to build emotionally resilient children, we need to validate the way they're feeling. Sometimes we use something which is called the dishcloth approach, which is essentially we'll just wipe the feelings away to move on quickly from this event and this situation. But if children and young people are struggling to process certain emotions, it's really important to stick with the way they're feeling, label that, to then move on to talk about it. And in order to boost our positive emotions, it's very important that we deal with those emotions that are more tricky. And one aspects of that is separating what children are feeling from the way they are behaving. So if it's a particular situation where a child or a young person is feeling very angry about something, then the anger as an emotion is completely normal and acceptable. However, the behaviour that follows might not be. So really separating the two. So that's tip number 3. And if we look at tip number 4, this is thinking about finding practical ways and tools to deal with worries. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment when I've got some resources to share with you. But in terms of some things we can do, which we know links directly to our positive education curriculum, it links to what the research tells us about what helps to boost children's positive emotions. So there's one aspect of mindfulness, which Miss Ward is going to cover a little bit more during question times, but I've just put a little picture here on the screen of a program called Zenden, which we use in school sometimes with some of the younger children as well. This is a potential tool for when children are feeling anxious or overwhelmed, or even when they're feeling positive emotions, to really help them to regulate themselves. Then we also have mindful colouring, another tool that we use in school, and mindful colouring is very important for helping children to really switch off for a moment and begin to relax and sort of let go of some of the worries that they've been carrying throughout the day. And in addition to that, also journaling. So journaling is important right through the school, from primary going up to secondary, even in adulthood. There's some great research behind the power of journaling, how this can help with boosting our positive emotions, boosting our sense of happiness, but also it's said to improve aspects of our working memory as well. So journaling is another great way to support children to deal with worries and any challenges of the day and think about how they can move on and build resilience. Okay, so we will move on to tip number 5 now, which is gratitude. So this, again, is another really important way of supporting children to really boost their positive emotions and their overall well-being. And the ways in which we can do this, so there are many ways, and it depends on sort of what's the right fit for you as a family. So we do these exercises in school. So it could be that they write a letter of gratitude to somebody close in their lives. One strategy that can be quite helpful, particularly for children that are worried about coming into school, which we do sometimes see children that are having increased anxiety if it's a new term, if it's when we're thinking about transition to new year groups, primary school to high school, FS to year 1, then these can be tricky times for children because of the amount of change that they're having to deal with. So one strategy that you could use is in a morning on the journey to school, thinking about 3 things that they're grateful for or 3 things that they're looking forward to that day. And that can really just support and boost them to get them into a positive mindset to start the day. And then what we want to do is look at what some of the tools and resources are that you can use to support your children. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we have something which is called a toolbox of well-being. And this is helpful strategies and activities for children, teenagers, their carers and teachers. And this is a really, really useful resource that we use just to look at some ways that we can support children at home with their well-being and aspects of the well-being. So that's something I would recommend. It really touches on aspects of mindfulness, aspects of gratitude, aspects of dealing with worries, and ultimately building resilience. And then you can see at the top of the screen, there's a range of different books that looks at children who are having a particular tricky time worrying about different situations. So you'll see when my worries get too big. And then we also have something called the Invisible String booklet. And if you have a child or know of anyone that has a child that is experiencing separation anxiety, this is a really good book to read together. I Can Handle It. So these are all books that provide us with a tool to really start conversations with children about the way they're feeling, but also think about how do we problem solve and think about some next steps for them. And as well as books, we also have our parent Padlet. And I would highly recommend that you do have a look at this resource. We have lots of things on there. So you will see videos that we've done previously for Mindful Mondays on different topics, different breathing exercises, which we know is a really important tool for supporting children with their self-regulation. And we do different breathing exercises with children across the key stages in school. So there's some really good resources on there about that. And then the different apps that we could use, and also tips for supporting children with sleep and tips for supporting children with internet safety. Which is something that we know has been quite prevalent over the course of the pandemic. And we also have some webinars on there where you can sort of look at different topics, whatever some of the current issues might be. There's some tips, strategies and advice. So we would suggest that you do log on to the Padlet there. Okay, so now we're going to look at the questions that you submitted. Feel free to type any questions as we go along as well, if there's anything else that you would like to know more about. So these are the questions that you submitted when signing up to today's webinar. So the first question is, how can you encourage a child who is not expressive of his or her emotions? Is there a way to be inquisitive without probing? So I will answer this from a primary school perspective, and then Miss Ward will cover this from a secondary perspective, because it does depend on the age of the child, and it can depend on the child's character, and we have to think there's not always a one size fits all. However, there are certain things we can do that we know are helpful ways to support children. So when I'm thinking about this, I think for me, it's very much going back to those strategies we talked about around emotion coaching. And if a child isn't expressing their feelings, if it's a younger child, just labeling what it is that you think they're feeling, or just wondering aloud what it is that you think they're feeling, is in many ways teaching them the first step of self-regulation. So that they can begin to understand, okay, when I feel like this is what this means. So I think just very much if it's the case of this particular child doesn't really feel comfortable opening up and talking about their feelings, then we just start with step one, which is just label and reflect the way you think they are feeling. I will also pass over now to Miss Ward, who can give us some top tips from a secondary perspective.
In secondary, this is one that we see a lot of because, as you know, they're a lot more dependent in primary. And when we see them in secondary, they want to be dependent on their parents still, but they're also going through a stage where they're having to be a bit more independent. And sometimes they are a bit introvert because they're not sure about how they're feeling themselves. And I think one good thing is actually not to focus on the emotions too much when you're having those initial discussions, but just ask them generally about the school day. So what did you do at school? What are you interested in? What did you enjoy? And then from those discussions, you would be able to get a sense of whether they are feeling particularly happy or sad about a certain event. One other thing I think in secondary that we should also encourage is letting the children know that there are so many people that they can talk to. They don't have to, sometimes they feel embarrassed, or they feel not most comfortable talking with parents. I know when I was growing up, I felt embarrassed talking to my mum about certain things, but knowing that they can go to their form tutor, different teachers that they get on very well with. We've got our secondary counsellor, primary counsellor. So there are so many people who are offering pastoral support for them. And if you just kind of encourage that as well, friendships as well, having those intimate conversations with your friends will help them kind of alleviate some emotions they're feeling. So it kind of ties in with number 2, the second question that I'm going to address is, how do I get my kids to be more socially active? They have been in online schooling for almost 2 years in our home country prior to coming here. And like Dr. Sumner said earlier, that is something we've seen a lot, isn't it? Unfortunately, due to the pandemic. And I would say one thing is really encouraging students to be in school on time. I know sometimes it's hard, isn't it, to get them out of bed, but that initial part in the morning is about kind of discussing with peers what they did the night before or on the weekend, and making sure they're settled and they feel ready for the school day. Encouraging them to join in lunchtime clubs, ECAs. That's a great opportunity to meet friends, and also sports clubs outside of school. And I think when we put the focus on them kind of ascertaining a common interest with another student, it takes the focus off of, oh, I have to make friends, and it will just happen more naturally. I'll pass over to Dr. Sumner now for question 3.
Okay, thank you. So how to help kids who are very sensitive and take advice or comments in a negative way, and those who can't hold their tears even for the smallest reason. So I think, again, it does depend on the age of the child. Older students, we may address this a little bit differently, but I think, in the first instance, I think accepting that some children are more sensitive than others, and that's okay to be sensitive, as a first step. And it's okay to feel sad, and it's okay to cry sometimes when we're feeling overwhelmed. So I think very much an acceptance is a first step. Now, it depends maybe what is underpinning some of this, or what is driving some of it. So if it's a case of a child or a young person is interpreting comments in a negative way most of the time, then maybe there's something else going on that's really feeding into this. Maybe there needs to be a little bit more work done on building their confidence and their self-esteem in certain situations. If that was the case, then I would certainly think to looking at how you could create more opportunities for them to shine and excel, really to build the confidence in that capacity. But also providing sometimes an alternate view to things when we are in a mindset where we perceive things in a negative way. Sometimes hearing alternate views can be helpful at different ways and different lenses of looking at things. In terms of holding their tears, I think this really depends on the age of the child as to whether it would be a concern and something we really needed to explore a little bit further, or if it's a younger child and they're struggling to hold the tears, then I guess we're coming back really to self-regulation, and how we support children to manage their emotions and to know that it is okay to cry. But what can we do to help ourselves when we feel sad? And do we recognize when we feel sad? And are they able to reach out to the adults around them when they feel sad? Would be definitely some of the things that I would be thinking about for that question. So if we move on to question number 4, how to boost calm behaviour and positive emotions in the kids. I think we've definitely touched upon some of this. In terms of calmness, there is a catchy phrase that I always use, which is calmness is contagious, and it really, really is. So children and young people learn to regulate and deal with stress based on the adults around them. And so increasing calm behaviour always helps if we're in a calm space. And those moments when we're not in a calm space, just taking a step back before reacting. So to, respond rather than react to situations. Calm behaviour, depending on the context, is things that we do in school, which we've covered, like mindful colouring. You would have mindful music. Miss Ward's going to talk a little bit about mindfulness. Those are some of the ways that we would promote calm behaviour. And boosting positive emotions, again, linked to gratitude and linked to journaling, and really noticing what our children and young people are interested in, because that is, one sure effective way to boost their positive emotions. And just wondering, is there anything from a particular secondary perspective, Miss Ward, that you think is helpful for students?
I think, I was just actually thinking that a lot of the time students do act on impulse, don't they? And that's what a lot of the conversations I've had with the students, that, I felt very annoyed in that situation. And that will lead on to mindfulness and teaching them, how do we calm down in those situations? And that in itself, if we teach the children in a situation, if I do feel like I'm going to act on impulse, until I'm sure about how I act, I should actually count down from 10, and that will lead us on to the next question about mindfulness, and that will naturally boost emotions and the feeling of calmness.
Absolutely. I think we've just had a question come in, so I'll just quickly look at this before we move on to our mindfulness question, which has come in. Tips to manage anger breakdowns, not like a tantrum, but genuine anger over a minor issue. Again, it is going to depend on the age of the child, and I would also think, what's going on for the young person or the child at this moment in time that might be sort of influencing some of that anger. However, if we're struggling to think of what some of the triggers are, it's really going back to, in that moment, what we have to understand is it's okay for a child or a young person to express anger, because it's actually a very normal emotion that we all experience. I know we can manage it in different ways, and we have different windows of tolerance with it, depending on our individual circumstances, our temperament. There's lots of interacting factors, but ultimately, I think to let a child or young person know that I can see you're angry, and it's okay to feel angry and frustrated, as a step one, just back to that labeling, literally label the way they're feeling. And one of the really important points for young people, children and young people, is never to try and respond and advise children and young people when they are in the height of feeling anger, because literally parts of our brain shut down, which means we can't listen and process information in the same way as we can when we're calm. So it's really about waiting till children and young people are in a calm space before we have those conversations around, I saw you were feeling angry, what's going on, but really helping children and young people to start to independently problem solve as well, which is when they start to really think more independently about the way they're feeling and how they can manage that. Because children and young people don't always have the tools, and they have yet the skill set to manage big emotions, and so we really have to support them through that as much as possible. Now, if it was a case of we now have seen an increase in anger in this child or this young person, and this is out of the norm, and it's really persistent and it's increased in concern, then of course, please reach out to school, and we'll be able to sort of give you some advice and support if there is a specific issue. But in terms of supporting children to deal with anger in the moment, very much acknowledging their emotion and the way that they're feeling in that moment, and then trying to support them once they're in a calm space to reflect upon what they might do differently next time, because the anger is okay in terms of feeling and emotion, but maybe the behavior was not. And so those are the types of conversations we will be having. Okay, and so if we move on to question 5, yep.
So how do I engage students to study with mindfulness? So this is something that they are used to at school already. So hopefully it will be quite easy to encourage them to do it at home as well. One thing that works really well, particularly with secondary school students, is the breathing techniques, because they're going through a lot of bodily changes, a lot of hormonal changes, and it is normal for them to feel irrational at times and to feel angry, but they don't know why they feel angry. One minute they can feel really happy, the next they can feel really sad. So getting them to count down from 20 or get them to count down from 10, just to really be present in the moment and to identify with how they are exactly feeling, would be really a really great thing to do. Secondly, they have reflective journals, and that is for their private use. And sometimes we will ask them to, in VIA sessions or wherever we deem appropriate, to write out their emotions, because sometimes they don't like to vocalize their emotions or they don't know how to. But if they're able just to, if we're able to provide an outlet for them, and if they are able to just write out how they're feeling, it doesn't need to make any sense necessarily, just write out their emotions, that can help them. That's a really wonderful mindful act for them to again engage with how they're feeling. There are also, as Dr. Sumner touched on earlier, mindful colouring, and there's such a variety out there. Just from the top of my head, anything from Harry Potter, nature, cats, dogs, oceans, anything they're interested in. And we would really strongly recommend at this stage not to do the mindful colouring on devices, although I know that there are a few apps that offer that, just because they are, in this day and age, with education and the games that they play, everything is online, and it is really important, I think, for mindfulness to have that time away from the screen, so they can have that rest and break. And they're the main things, drawing, doodling. They're the main things that I've seen in secondary that really help the students engage with how they're feeling. I'll pass on to Dr. Sumner for question 6.
Thank you. Sometimes when my child is crying, as a parent, I don't understand what to do. What would your advice be? And so I think we've definitely touched upon this in some areas. And again, depending on the age of the child, is the child able to communicate verbally? Because if they're at the stage where they're not really communicating with words, then that there will be a different thing that we're looking to respond to. And what I would suggest is, when your child is crying, to, of course, comfort them in the first instance, but think about what it was that happened before they started crying. So depending on the age of the child, it might be that they're just tired, they're just hungry, all the basic needs that need to be met. But if it is that they're crying in the context of like social situations, just really observing and being curious as to what happens before they're upset. And just very much the best thing to do is to respond in that moment and acknowledge the way they're feeling and really comfort them. And I think, some of the things that Miss Ward mentioned are really excellent tools that you can use, and breathing exercises. If a child's like crying and really distressed and it's hard to calm them down in that moment, actually using some of those breathing exercises can really make a difference. And sometimes when children are crying, this is, they don't always know why. They might not always be able to articulate a reason, but ultimately, if they know that the adults around them respond to them when they're feeling upset and vulnerable, and that there's a safe space, then they can move on from it and build resilience going forward. So it's just, I know within the context of Dubai and how busy people's lives are, and how fast-paced things are. There's, that people have lots of different responsibilities, priorities, work lives. And so one of the things, like the key messages for supporting the well-being of our children and young people really is about, when we think about the time we spend with them, it's not the quantity of time, but the quality of time. And that's really important, because we might not be able to spend as much time with our children as we would ultimately like to because of other life responsibilities. If when we do spend the time, it is quality time and we are connected and the devices are away and we are speaking to each other about what's been going on in school and doing activities that support that process of bonding, then I think that is something that really supports children with their emotional resilience in the future. Okay. So next question, I'll hand you over to Miss Ward.
The last question is how to motivate kids for school after long-term breaks. And I think one of the main things is, obviously with secondary students, they're old enough to kind of think about the wider picture. And in school, we teach them about spirituality in terms of having a meaning and having a purpose. And I think it's best always to approach those kinds of situations with looking at the wider picture in terms of the building blocks for your future self, the building blocks for adulthood. But not only that, like Dr. Sumner said, kind of accept the emotions they are feeling at the time, because it is normal to feel that way. Sometimes you do just want to stay in bed, or you do just want to have a longer break. But as long as we don't disregard those emotions and say, it's normal to feel that way. Sometimes I don't want to wake up for work, but then link it into the bigger picture for them, why they are going to school, what's the purpose, what's the meaning behind going to school. Hopefully they'll see that actually I am doing this for a purpose. I get to see my friends, I get to engage in lots of fun activities, learn different strengths and skills, and hopefully that will help them ease back in. And I think, that was the main thing I wanted to touch upon. So the wider purpose and meaning, and name it, tame it. So appreciate that they are feeling a bit sluggish sometimes. They are feeling that they don't want to go back. It's normal, but we also need to learn how to work through those emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that really covers all of the questions that sort of came through before the webinar and whilst it was ongoing. So I think that's pretty much all from us. If there's any more information that you would like, then please feel free to send a message over on the Facebook page or via email. We'll get back to you, but thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.